Alexander Montgomery arrived in New York City with absolute certainty. He knew the flight number. He knew the address. He knew the attorney's name, the case file reference, and exactly how many minutes it would take him to sign the divorce papers and close, forever, the most painful chapter of his life. 40 years of building an empire had taught him one thing. Information was power. And he had all the information. Or so he believed. Because on the other side of a blue iron gate in Brooklyn, there was a truth no one had told him. A small truth 2 years old, with his same eyes, who at that very moment was chasing an ant across the patio, completely unaware that he had just changed everything. Everything Alexander knew was about to stop being enough. Before we continue, we want to thank every person joining us from anywhere in the world. Your presence gives this space more life and meaning. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. It will be a pleasure to greet you. Thank you for being here. Now, without further delay, the story begins. The plane landed at John F. Kennedy International Airport at 6:47 in the morning, 15 minutes early, as if even the weather had decided to be efficient that day. Alexander Montgomery was the first to stand when the seatbelt sign turned off. Not because he was in a hurry, but because he was the kind of man who always sat in the first row and never waited for anyone. 3 years in Chicago had only hardened his habits. Waking before sunrise, making decisions before his competitors, and solving problems with the same cold precision with which he signed 8-figure contracts. Today was no different. Today was merely another procedure. As he crossed the terminal with his briefcase in hand and his dark glasses still on, though the October sun had barely begun to rise, his phone vibrated. It was Attorney Grant Sullivan. "Everything is in order, Mr. Montgomery," the lawyer said with that polished voice he used for bad news disguised as good news. "The documents are ready. Mrs. Harper has been notified. She can sign today." "Any problem?" "None," Sullivan replied. Then, after a pause so brief it almost did not exist, he added, "Mrs. Harper has been calm. Very calm, I would say." Alexander found nothing remarkable in that. Valerie had always been calm. It was one of the things he had once liked about her, before that same calm began to feel like indifference. "Good," he said. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. He ended the call, without saying goodbye. Not out of rudeness, but because goodbye seemed like a waste of time when there was nothing else to say. The driver was waiting outside with the black car, the same model Alexander used in New York before he left. Alexander got in without looking him in the eyes, gave the address from memory, and leaned back in the seat while the city began to wake beyond the window. Coffee stands on the corners. Delivery trucks loaded with flowers for the markets. The first workers walking fast with their collars tucked into their October coats. New York at 7 in the morning was exactly as he had left it. Loud, urgent, completely indifferent to his return. Fine. He was indifferent to it as well. They crossed south toward Brooklyn, and the landscape began to change. The wide avenues and glass towers of Midtown disappeared behind them, replaced by narrow streets, old brick homes, painted doors, iron fences, and small gardens that refused to disappear beneath the city's weight. "Next one," Alexander said. The driver nodded and slowed down. "The teacher's house?" the man asked quietly, almost to himself. Alexander frowned. "You know her?" "By sight, sir. Nice lady." The driver paused briefly as he turned the wheel. "Very brave." "Brave." Alexander repeated the word silently while the car stopped in front of a blue-painted townhouse with pots of bougainvillea near the entrance and a small black iron gate. It was not the house of a millionaire. It was the house of someone who had learned how to make small things enough. Why brave? Brave for what? For living alone? For not moving somewhere bigger after the divorce? It made no sense. Valerie was not the kind of woman who needed a stranger to describe her with that word. Alexander opened the car door, stepped onto the sidewalk with his briefcase in hand, and adjusted his suit jacket. He breathed in the Brooklyn air. It smelled like wet earth and something he could not immediately identify. He had the documents. He had the pen. He had 40 years of discipline telling him this was simple. But when he approached the gate and lifted his hand to knock, he heard something that was not in any of his plans. A small laugh. Clear. Carefree. The kind of laugh only very young children have when something seems extraordinarily funny. And it was far too young to belong to Valerie. Valerie had stayed silent to protect her son. But would you have done the same? Or would you have shouted the truth, no matter the cost? Tell us, silence or truth. Because what Alexander is about to find when he crosses that gate is something no one saw coming. Alexander did not knock. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, one hand suspended in the air and the briefcase hanging from his other arm, like a man who had just forgotten why he had entered a room. The laughter had stopped. Now there was another sound. Small, clumsy footsteps. The kind of footsteps that do not quite know where they are going yet, but are fully convinced the whole world was built to welcome them. Through the bars of the gate, between the pots of bougainvillea and the shadow of the lemon tree that covered half the patio, Alexander saw the child. He was about 2 years old, maybe a little older. He wore a yellow shirt with a stain that was probably breakfast and denim shorts that were too big for him. He walked with his arms stretched out to one side, with the absolute concentration of someone learning that balance is not something given, but something conquered step by step. Valerie was sitting on the front step with a cup in her hands and her hair tied back carelessly, like someone who was not expecting visitors. But when she lifted her eyes toward the gate, Alexander understood immediately that she had been expecting him. She did not startle. She did not spill her coffee. She did not open her mouth with that look of surprise people have when life interrupts them without warning. She simply looked at him with a calm that was not indifference, but something more complicated. Something built through years of practice and necessity. Then she stood slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. She reached for the child, gently held him by the shoulders, and walked toward the gate. Alexander did not move. Valerie opened the latch without rushing, pushed the gate inward, and looked at him from the other side with those dark eyes he had tried, with little success, not to remember for 3 years. Alexander, she said. Only his name. No question. No question. Only his name, as if naming something she already knew was there. He opened his mouth to say something. Anything. Any one of the prepared lines he had rehearsed on the plane about contracts, dates and legal procedures. But then the child, bored by the silence of the adults, lifted his face toward him, and Alexander stopped breathing. It was not a vague resemblance, the kind people exaggerate at family gatherings to make parents feel good. It was an anatomical certainty that left no room for interpretation. The exact shape of the eyelids, the straight line of the brows, the peculiar shade of brown that his mother had always described as coffee with something inside it that was not coffee. It was the same gaze he had seen his entire life in the mirror, transplanted without permission onto a small face that watched him with the careless curiosity of someone who did not yet know that some things could hurt. Dog, the child announced suddenly, pointing toward the house next door with absolute authority. Dog. Dog. Valerie looked down at him with a smile so brief it almost did not exist. Yes, my love. We'll see him later. From inside the house came slow, deliberate footsteps. An older man appeared in the doorway, with large hands that looked as if they had worked wood for a lifetime, and an expression that was not hostile, but not welcoming either. He looked Alexander up and down with the patience of someone examining an object he had not yet decided was worth repairing. You're here, he said. It was not a question. It was not a greeting. It was the statement of someone who had been waiting for something inevitable to happen. Then he turned and disappeared inside, leaving the door half open, like an invitation Alexander would have to decide whether to accept. Valerie looked at him again. The child had lost interest in the invisible dog, and was now studying an ant on the ground with scientific concentration. Shall we go in? She asked. There was no victory in her voice. No bitterness. Only the question of someone who knew the conversation ahead had been waiting for 3 years, and that it was finally time to have it. Alexander looked once more into the child's eyes. Then he looked at Valerie, and for the first time in 40 years, he did not know what to say. Alexander saw those eyes and understood without words, without explanations. He simply knew. Have you ever had a moment when the truth hit you before you could protect yourself from it? Tell us. Yes, I lived it. Or no, it never happened to me. Because what Valerie is about to tell him will change everything. Valerie's kitchen was the kind of place that did not apologize for being what it was. Hand-painted tiles covered the walls, green and yellow and blue, not matching each other, yet somehow forming something whole. There was a wooden table with paint peeling from one corner, clay pots hanging near the window, and in the high chair by the wall, Matthew was attacking a plate of scrambled eggs with great determination, completely unaware of the storm forming 6 feet away. Valerie placed a cup of coffee in front of Alexander without asking whether he wanted it. He did not touch it. "When I found out I was pregnant," she began, without preamble, without the kind of introduction people use when they want to soften what comes next. "I called you many times. My number was blocked from yours." Alexander opened his mouth. "I called your office," Valerie continued, as if she had not seen the gesture. "They told me you were in meetings. Always in meetings. They said they would give you the message. You never called back." "I never received any." "I know," she said. "Now I know." Those 3 words fell into the space between them with the heavy weight of something that had waited a long time to be said. Alexander remained silent. "I came here. To this house. Not to the one on the Upper East Side." Valerie wrapped both hands around her cup, not to drink, but to hold on to something. "Your mother received me in the living room. She offered me tea. She was very kind." There was something in the way she said very kind that made Alexander feel cold. "She told me she had already informed you. That you had decided it was better this way. That you did not want legal complications before the baby was born. That you would sign the divorce papers afterward, so everything would remain clean." Valerie looked directly at him. "She told me you had been very clear about it." The world did not move. The tiles stayed in place. Matthew continued eating his eggs. But something inside Alexander Montgomery, something he had spent years building with discipline and distance, began to crack with the silent sound of things breaking from within. "I didn't know," he said. His own voice sounded strange to him, too small for the man he believed himself to be. "Valerie, I didn't know anything." She studied him for a long moment. Then she stood, went to the drawer beside the sink, and pulled out a manila envelope with corners bent from being opened and closed too many times. She placed it on the table between them. "Blocked call log," she said, pointing to the first page. "Attempts to contact your office," with dates and the names of the people who answered. The second sheet was a handwritten letter on formal stationery. Alexander recognized the handwriting before reading a single word. It was the same handwriting that had signed his birthday cards for 40 years. The same handwriting that had written with love, "Your mother," at the bottom of every note she tucked into his lunchbox when he was a child. He read it, and every line was worse than the last. "If you truly want what is best for the child, you will understand that discretion is the only civilized option. The Montgomery family cannot be involved in circumstances that compromise its reputation. I assure you that you will be taken care of financially, provided that." "Mom," Matthew announced from his chair with the urgency of someone reporting important business. "More." Valerie turned toward him with such a complete transformation that Alexander almost could not process it. The woman who had been speaking in a flat, controlled voice disappeared, and in her place appeared someone warm, immediate, entirely present. "More what, my love?" "More egg," Matthew confirmed, pointing at the empty plate with a spoon that also served as a percussion instrument. "Right away, sweetheart." Alexander watched that 4-second exchange, and felt something he could not name. It was not guilt yet, though it looked like it. It was more like suddenly understanding the exact size of what he had missed. Valerie sat down again. She looked at him with that calm he was beginning to understand. It was not coldness. It was the only armor available, when there was nothing else left. "I believed you knew," she said. "For 3 years, I believed you had chosen not to be here. And I accepted it because I had no other choice. But I kept all of this." She touched the envelope. "Because I knew that someday someone would need to see it." Alexander held his mother's letter in his hands. The paper was real. The handwriting was real. And the story he had lived for 3 years had just become something completely different. Alexander was not able to drive. He sat in the back seat of the car with the door closed, while the driver stood discreetly across the street, smoking with the tact of someone who had worked for rich people long enough to know when not to exist. The briefcase with the divorce documents was on the seat beside him. The pen was still in the inside pocket of his jacket, unused. Alexander took out his phone. 40 years of discipline told him that the correct way to handle new information was to verify it before acting. Not with emotion. With method. He had built an empire doing exactly that. Separating what he felt from what he knew. Then working from the second. He dialed Sullivan's number. Mr. Montgomery. The attorney answered on the second ring, with the efficiency of someone who had been holding the phone and waiting. Everything all right with the documents? One question, Alexander said. His voice was the same as always. Flat. Precise. Without temperature. During the 3 years you handled the process, how many times did you have direct contact with Mrs. Harper? A brief pause. Almost imperceptible. But Alexander had spent 20 years reading silences in negotiation rooms. And this silence had the specific sound of someone rearranging what he had planned to say. Contact was minimal and strictly professional, as appropriate, Sullivan replied. Everything went through formal channels. Which channels specifically? Written correspondence. Legal notices. Standard procedure. Alexander let 3 seconds pass before speaking. And the letter? The silence this time was different. Longer. With a different texture. Not a pause for thinking. A pause for calculating damage. I don't know what letter you're talking about, Mr. Montgomery. There it was. Not what letter. Not which letter do you mean? I don't know what letter you're talking about. A sentence that assumed the existence of a specific letter before denying knowledge of it. It was the kind of mistake inexperienced witnesses made. Denying the contents before anyone had even asked whether they knew the container existed. Of course, Alexander said. Thank you, Grant. He ended the call. He used his first name. For 15 years he had called him Sullivan, and the attorney knew it. The change was not accidental. Alexander put the phone away and stared at the back of the front seat without seeing it. With that concentrated stillness his partners in Chicago had learned to respect, because it usually came before his most expensive decisions. His mind worked the way it always did. Building structures, identifying variables, drawing lines between points others did not see as connected. Sullivan knew about the letter. His mother had written the letter. Valerie had kept the letter for 3 years. And he had spent those same 3 years in Chicago convinced he was the injured party. Then he saw her through the car window. On the second floor of the Blue House, Valerie sat at a tilted table with a paintbrush in her hand. She was not looking at him. She probably did not know he was still there. She had the particular concentration of someone entirely inside the thing she was doing. The state in which the outside world loses relevance, and only the task before the eyes exists. She was painting. From that distance, Alexander could not tell what she was painting, but it did not matter. What mattered was the posture. The back slightly bent forward. The wrist moving with a confidence that needed no one's approval. A woman who had found something completely her own in the margins of a life that had not gone as expected. He had spent 3 years building meetings, contracts, and cold marble floors. She had spent 3 years building this. He placed the divorce documents back inside the briefcase and closed the zipper with a click that sounded, in the silence of the car, like a decision. He would not sign today. Not because he did not know what to do, but because for the first time in a long time, he needed to make sure he knew exactly what was true before putting his name on any paper. He tapped the window to call the driver. But before the man put out his cigarette, Alexander's phone vibrated again. A number he had not expected to see that morning. A number that had not called him first in years. It was Ryan. Ryan said nothing important on that call. He only asked where Alexander was, with a voice that had too much effort invested in sounding casual. And when Alexander told him he was in Brooklyn, there was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm that his younger brother already knew why. "We'll talk later," Alexander said, and ended the call. He gave the driver the address of a private clinic on the Upper East Side. Not the family clinic the Montgomerys had used for 30 years, where the receptionists knew his mother by first name. A different one. Discreet. The kind that did not ask extra questions when a man in a suit walked in requesting a paternity test. He leaned forward to retrieve the briefcase from the front seat when he saw it. A small white envelope with no letterhead, placed precisely in the space between the seat and the center console. It had not been there when he got into the car that morning. Someone had put it there while he was inside the blue house. He picked it up. His name was written on the front in handwriting he recognized immediately. The same calm, controlled handwriting from the kitchen with the hand-painted tiles and the neatly preserved documents. Alexander opened it. Inside were 2 sheets. The first was technical, full of scientific terminology, percentages, and references to genetic markers Alexander did not need to understand in detail to understand the only thing that mattered. The second sheet was a patient summary written in simple language, with one number printed in bold at the center of the page. 99.97%. And below it, in smaller letters, probability of biological paternity confirmed. Alexander reread the number 3 times. Not because he doubted what it said, but because his brain, which had spent the entire morning building hypotheses and verifying variables, needed a moment to process that the answer to the most important question already existed. Valerie had not waited for him to arrive before looking for it. 2 years earlier, alone, with the resources she had found a way to obtain what she needed to protect her son. He called the clinic to cancel. "It's no longer necessary," he said when they answered. "Thank you." He sat in the car parked in front of the clinic he no longer needed to visit, holding the 2 sheets in his hands and listening to the noise of the Upper East Side outside. Delivery trucks. Heels on pavement. A dog barking 3 floors above. The world remained completely indifferent to the fact that Alexander Montgomery had just discovered he had a 2-year-old son who said "Mom," with the absolute conviction of someone who knew exactly who that person was. He folded the pages carefully and placed them in the inside pocket of his jacket, beside his heart, in the same place where he kept documents that could not be lost. Then he called Ryan. His brother answered on the first ring. "Alex," he said, using the shortened version of his name the way he had since they were boys, whenever he wanted something or had done something wrong. In this case, Alexander already knew it was the second. "Did you know?" Alexander asked. No context. No preamble. The question was clear enough. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Alexander counted them. "Not everything," Ryan finally said. "Not the details. But I saw things. I heard things. And I chose not to ask more." "How long?" "About 2 years." 2 years. The same amount of time Valerie had been keeping a paternity result in a white envelope, waiting for the right moment. The same amount of time his younger brother had consciously chosen not to know more. "Alex, listen to me," Ryan said, and now his voice carried an urgency that was not guilt, but fear. "Mom has her reasons. She always has. If you talk to her first, if you give her the chance to explain." "Her reasons," Alexander repeated slowly, as if examining the words from the outside. "It's not that simple, Alex. The family, the name, everything Dad built." "There is a child," Alexander said. Something in his voice made Ryan stop speaking. "There is a child with my blood who does not know I exist because someone decided it was simpler that way. That is what is simple, Ryan. Everything else is noise." A long silence followed. "I know," Ryan said finally very quietly. "That's why I called." Alexander put the phone away and looked through the window at the clinic building, with its glass facade and perfectly symmetrical planters. Inside, someone else would be waiting for results. Waiting for a number to tell them what they already knew or what they feared knowing. He already had his number. 99.97%. And that night, he needed to have a conversation he had spent 40 years avoiding. The Montgomery mansion on the Upper East Side smelled the same as always. Fresh flowers in the foyer, replaced every Monday by the same florist they had used for 30 years. Wax on the wooden floors. Something that was not exactly cold, but not warmth either. The kind of temperature places have when money has been there long enough to absorb the personality of the walls. Mrs. Caroline Montgomery was in the main living room when Alexander entered without announcing himself. She sat in her usual armchair with a cup of tea and the folded newspaper on her lap, as if she had been waiting for him. Maybe she had. His mother had always possessed that uncomfortable gift of anticipating arrivals. "My son," she said with her usual warmth. "I didn't know you were coming today." "Yes, you did," Alexander said. She looked at him for a moment over the rim of the cup, then placed it on the side table with that millimeter-perfect control she had over every movement. Sit down. No. It was the first time in 40 years that Alexander had answered that word with that other one. Caroline Montgomery processed the change without visibly reacting, which in itself was a kind of response. Alexander opened his briefcase and placed the documents on the coffee table one by one. The handwritten letter, the blocked call log, the paternity summary with 99.97% in bold. His mother looked at them, not with fear, with something closer to recognition, as if seeing the arrival of something she had always known would eventually come. I did it for you, she said. Alexander had prepared many responses for that moment. He had not expected that one. For me, everything I did was so you could become great. Her voice was the same as always. Firm, certain, with the particular conviction of someone who had spent decades being the person who made difficult decisions. That woman was not for you, Alexander. She did not have the name. She did not have the upbringing. She did not understand what it means to be a Montgomery. A child with her would have tied you for life to something that would have held you back. There is a child, Alexander said. His name is Matthew. I know what his name is. The silence that followed had a specific weight. Of course you know, Alexander said. And his last name, Mother? What is his full name? Caroline did not answer. That was when the study door opened, and Ryan walked in with the expression of someone who had been listening longer than he should have. He looked at his brother, then at his mother. Then he stayed frozen in the doorway, like a man who still did not know which side of the door he belonged on. Did you know all of this? Alexander asked him directly. Ryan could not hold his gaze. The most honest answer he gave in that room was the way his eyes dropped to the floor. Alex, if you let me explain. No. Alexander gathered the documents from the table. Not anymore. Caroline stood slowly. For the first time since Alexander had entered, there was something in her posture that was not completely controlled. It was the posture of someone who feels the ground move and tries to recover balance. Everything your father and I built, she said. Every sacrifice. Every difficult decision. It was all so this name would mean something. Do you think it was easy? Do you think there were not things we had to do that cost us? What things, Mother? She looked at him, and in that instant Alexander saw something pass across her face that he had never seen before. Not guilt. Something older and more complicated than that. Your father also had to make difficult decisions, she said more quietly. With his first family. Before me. These things are handled. They are handled with discretion, and people move forward. That is how the real world works, my son, whether you like it or not. First family. Alexander became completely still. Dad had a family before you? Caroline seemed to realize in that exact moment what she had just said. The teacup was on the table. The Monday flowers were in the foyer. Everything was in its place as always. Except the words could no longer be taken back. That is not relevant. Where are they? Alexander asked. Where are those people now? His mother's silence was the longest and heaviest answer of the evening. Alexander closed the briefcase, buttoned his jacket with the same automatic gesture he used when leaving boardrooms, and walked toward the door without saying anything else. Behind him, he heard his mother call his name once, in the voice that had been able to stop him for 4 decades. This time he did not stop. He was crossing the foyer between the Monday flowers when his phone vibrated. A message from Ryan. There is something else you need to know. Something Mom does not know I know. Can you come alone? The coffee shop in Greenwich Village had scratched wooden chairs, tables too close together, and the smell of freshly ground coffee that did not ask permission to occupy every inch of space. Ryan was already there when Alexander arrived. He had ordered 2 coffees without asking, which meant he had been waiting for a while, or he needed something to do with his hands while he waited. Probably both. Alexander sat down without greeting him. Talk. Ryan wrapped both hands around his cup the way Valerie had done that morning, and Alexander noticed the resemblance within discomfort he could not classify. 2 years ago, Ryan began, in the voice of someone who had rehearsed these words long enough for them to no longer sound rehearsed. I came to the Upper East Side house early. Mom didn't know I was there. She was in the study with Sullivan. The door wasn't fully closed. What did you hear? Valerie's name. An amount of money. Ryan paused. I didn't hear the full context. I told myself it was probably something about the divorce. Some pending legal arrangement that was not my place to ask about. But you knew it was not only that. It was not a question. Ryan did not treat it as one. I knew it was not only that, he admitted quietly. And I chose not to know more. He lifted his eyes to his brother for the first time since they had sat down. That is also a decision, Alex. Not asking is also deciding. I know. Alexander picked up his coffee, not because he wanted it, but because he needed 1 second before answering. And holding something warm was better than the alternative. What else? Sullivan has an office. Not the main firm. A small one on West 34th Street under the name of a company that does not really exist. Ryan pulled a folded paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. That is where he keeps the documents that cannot appear in the official file. I went once to pick something up for Mom. I saw enough to understand what kind of documents they were. Alexander took the paper. An address. A floor number. The name of the shell company. Ryan's handwriting was rushed, like the writing of someone who had been carrying something too long. Why do you have this? Because I wrote it down that same night, Ryan said. When I got back to my apartment and realized I had chosen not to ask, I wrote it down as if some part of me knew that one day I would need it. He picked up his cup, then set it down without drinking. Or that you would. Alexander folded the paper and put it away without speaking. Around them, the coffee shop continued with its ordinary life. 2 women at the next table argued about a wedding. An older man read the newspaper with his glasses low on his nose. Behind the counter, the barista ground more coffee with professional indifference. The world remained completely unaware that 2 Montgomery brothers were sitting in scratched chairs, deciding whether they still knew each other. Why call me now? Alexander asked. After 2 years. Why today? Ryan took time to answer. When he did not use any of the phrases Alexander expected. He did not say, because it is the right thing to do. He did not say, because I could not carry it anymore. He said something different. Something smaller, and therefore more true. I want to meet Matthew. Alexander looked at him. Not as part of some arrangement, Ryan continued, with an urgency that was not calculated. Not to look good. Not to compensate for anything. I want to meet him because he is my nephew. And because I am afraid of continuing to make decisions like someone who chooses not to know. I am tired of being this family's shadow. The coffee cooled in the cups. Alexander looked at his younger brother. The man who had grown up always 1 step behind. Always on the edge of important decisions. Always choosing silence when silence was easier. And for the first time, he saw that Ryan knew it. That he had always known it. Maybe that was the most honest part of everything he had said. Alexander stood and placed money on the table without counting the bills. Fear is not enough, Ryan, he said. Then he paused. But it is a beginning. He stepped into the night of Greenwich Village without waiting for an answer. 2 hours later, he was parked in front of the Blue House in Brooklyn with the engine off. The lights on the 2nd floor were on. Through the window he could see Valerie's shadow moving inside. Stopping in one place, then continuing to another, with the quiet rhythm of someone performing the small, necessary rituals of putting a child to bed. Alexander did not go in. He sat there in the silence of the car, watching that light, thinking of a woman who had kept a white envelope for 2 years, and of a child who had taken his hand in the dark patio without knowing who he was. And he understood that what he was about to do the next day was not only for his son. It was also for her. The wooden box was small, handmade, with reinforced corners and a lid that closed with a brass latch. Mr. Preston Harper had built it himself, with the same patience he brought to any piece worth preserving. Valerie placed it on the living room table without ceremony, like someone handing over something she had carried too long, and could finally release. There is more, she said. Beneath the manila envelope Alexander already knew. There was another document. A legal letter dated 18 months earlier, written in technical language that was a threat disguised as procedure. If Mrs. Harper continued attempting to establish contact with members of the Montgomery family, the family would initiate a review of the child's custody, given that certain conditions in the child's environment could be considered unfavorable to his development. Alexander read the paragraph twice, then a third time. They threatened to take Matthew from you? That is why I stayed silent, Valerie said. Not because I was afraid of them, because I was afraid of losing him. There is a difference. That was when Mr. Harper spoke from the armchair, though no one had asked him to, and no one wanted to stop him. I knew Eleanor 40 years ago, he said, with the voice of someone who names the dead with the respect they deserve. She was Mr. Montgomery's wife before Caroline. They had a son. And one day, they disappeared as if they had never existed. No money, no name, no explanation large enough to live on. He paused. Eleanor died 10 years ago. Alone. Her son never knew who his father was until it was too late for it to matter. Alexander said nothing. He stood slowly and walked out to the patio. It was not the exit of a man running away. It was the exit of a man who needed a bigger ceiling, because the one inside could no longer contain what he was processing. He sat on the stone step. The garden was dark and smelled of wet earth and the last flowers of summer resisting October. The lemon tree creaked softly. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked without conviction. Valerie came out after him. She did not sit. She stood beside him with her hands in her pockets, looking at the same dark garden without trying to fill the silence with useless words. She waited. That was what Valerie Harper had learned to do better than anyone. Wait without surrendering. Matthew asks about you, she said finally, when the silence had served its purpose. I do not know exactly what he understands about all this, but he asks. A brief, honest pause. I told him his father is a man who is still learning how to stay. Alexander closed his eyes. Inside his chest, something that had not moved in 40 years shifted. Something he had learned to call discipline, which in that dark Brooklyn patio was beginning to look like something else entirely. They heard small footsteps in the doorway. Matthew had come out alone, his hair flattened by sleep and his eyes half closed, searching for his mother with the quiet urgency of children who wake up and need to confirm that the world has not moved while they were asleep. He found Alexander first. He looked at him for a moment with those eyes that were his and were not his, with the total absence of fear only children have before they learn to distrust the world. Then, without hesitation, without asking permission, he stretched his small hand toward him in the darkness of the patio. Alexander took it, and he understood that tomorrow, everything would change for everyone. The Montgomery Group boardroom had windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, and a 12-seat table that had never been used for anything like this. Alexander arrived first. He placed the documents in the center of the table with the precision of someone who had prepared this presentation not in hours, but in years, though he had not known it until now. As the others entered, he greeted them with his usual automatic courtesy. The board members, confused by the last-minute meeting. Attorney Grant Sullivan, holding a folder far too tightly. Ryan, who entered last and chose to sit beside his brother without anyone asking him to. Mrs. Caroline Montgomery arrived in the navy suit she wore for important occasions, with the certainty of someone who had spent 4 decades being the most powerful person in any room she occupied. She looked at the table. She looked at those present. Then she sat in her usual place with the economy of movement of someone who did not need to prove anything. Alexander waited until everyone was seated. This meeting is not about business, he said. It is about a child named Matthew, who has the right to know who he is, and about the people who decided that right did not matter. No one spoke. He placed the documents one by one before the board with the same calm he had used to build every important presentation of his career. His mother's handwritten letter, the blocked call log, the paternity test summary, and finally, the document Ryan had helped him recover the night before from the archive in the West 34th Street office. A confidentiality agreement signed by attorney Grant Sullivan and approved with Caroline Montgomery's signature, dated 3 years earlier, with clauses that left no room for interpretation. That was when the door opened. Valerie entered first, with a folder under her arm, and the posture of someone who had crossed far more difficult thresholds than this one. Mr. Harper followed her, with his large, steady hands and the calm of a man who did not need to hurry because he had already waited long enough for this moment. Caroline saw them enter, and for the first time in all the years Alexander had known her, his mother did not know what to do with her face. "You," she said, looking at Valerie. "How dare you?" "I dare," Valerie said, without raising her voice and without rushing. "Because I am the mother of your grandson. And because I have everything I need." She sat down. Mr. Harper sat beside her. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when an entire room understands at once that the power inside it has just been redistributed. Sullivan looked at Caroline, then at Alexander, then at the contract with his own signature on the table. "I need to speak with my own attorney," he said. Those 7 words confirmed before the board everything the documents already said. Caroline stood slowly. She looked at her eldest son with an expression Alexander had never seen on her before. Something beneath the usual composure. Something older and more tired than the Mrs. Montgomery everyone knew. "I gave you everything," she said. "You gave me everything except the truth, Mother." There was no rage in Alexander's voice. There was something worse. The calm of a man who no longer needed the other person to understand. And that was the only thing that mattered. Across the room, among whispering board members and documents that spoke for themselves, Alexander found Valerie's eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, without hurry, as if she could finally afford that luxury. Then very slowly she nodded. Only that. But Alexander understood. The hardest part had not been today. The hardest part was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Alexander Montgomery was living in a 2-bedroom apartment 10 minutes on foot from the Blue House. It was not the kind of place he would have chosen 4 months earlier. It had no marble floors, no windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, no controlled silence of old money. It had a small kitchen where he had learned to make spiced coffee with more failed attempts than he was willing to admit, and a table by the window from which he could see the park where, on Sundays, people walked their dogs and their children with the same carefree ease. That afternoon, the garden of the Blue House smelled of wet earth and bougainvillea. Matthew had spent 20 minutes chasing the neighbor's cat, a gray and dignified animal named Mr. Whiskers, who tolerated the pursuit with the patience of a creature old enough to know children eventually get tired. Valerie and Alexander sat in the wooden chairs beside the lemon tree, holding coffees that had gone cold, because neither of them remembered to drink them. "Today he said Mr. Whiskers is his best friend," Valerie said. "The cat does not even acknowledge him. Mr. Whiskers ignores him majestically." She paused. "That is why he is his best friend. Matthew admires independence." Alexander laughed. It was not a calculated laugh. Not a polite one. It was the laugh of someone who had not expected something to be funny. And then it was. The kind of laugh that happens when the guard is down and the world allows itself, for a moment, to be simply amusing. Valerie glanced at him from the side with something that was not yet complete trust, but looked more like it than anything in the past few weeks. "And work?" she asked. "I handed executive control to the board last week." He said it with the same naturalness with which he might have mentioned the weather. "I keep the shares, but the day-to-day operations are no longer mine." Valerie took a moment before answering. "And what are you going to do with all that time?" Alexander looked at Matthew, who had abandoned the pursuit of the cat, and was now inspecting a stone with the seriousness of a field geologist. "Learn," he said. That was when Mr. Harper arrived with 2 fresh cups, as if he had been waiting for the exact moment to appear. He placed them on the small table, looked at Alexander with the same measuring gaze he had given him since the first day, and said, "Crooked wood, if you work it with patience, sometimes becomes the finest piece in the shop." Then he turned and went back inside without waiting for an answer, because Mr. Preston Harper did not make statements in order to receive applause. Alexander held the warm cup in his hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that had not already been said. The Sunday sun was sinking slowly over the Brooklyn rooftops when the gate opened. Ryan entered with a bag of oranges and the expression of someone who did not know whether he would be welcome, but had decided it was worth trying. He stopped at the garden entrance. Valerie looked at Alexander. Alexander looked at Valerie. She stood and went to open the gate. Matthew heard it and turned. When he saw the unfamiliar man holding a bag of oranges, He did what he did with anything that interested him. He walked straight toward him without fear, with that absolute trust of someone who has not yet learned that the world sometimes disappoints. Ryan crouched until he was at his height. The two looked at each other in silence. And while the blue Brooklyn garden filled with the last light of Sunday, Alexander Montgomery finally understood what his mother had never taught him. The true weight is not the one that bends you. It is the one you choose to carry because it is worth it. And Matthew, with dirt on his shoes and half an orange in his hand, was the lightest and most important weight Alexander had ever carried in his life. There is a question this story leaves us with, not on our lips, but somewhere deeper, in that place where we keep the things we still do not know how to name. How many times in life have we believed a complete story without knowing that someone had torn out the most important pages? Alexander lived for 3 years convinced he was the wounded one. Valerie lived those same 3 years convinced she had been abandoned. And both of them were right inside the story they had been told. The problem was not what they knew. The problem was what they did not know they did not know. That happens more often than we like to admit. In families. In marriages. In the relationships between parents and children. There are silences that turn into walls without anyone consciously laying the first brick. A misunderstanding no one cleared up in time. A conversation postponed until there was no longer any way to have it. A truth someone decided to manage in the name of love, without understanding that love without truth is only control with better presentation. Caroline Montgomery was not a monster. She was something far more common, and therefore far more dangerous. She was a person who loved in the only way she had learned, by controlling. And over time, that destroys exactly what it tries to protect. Valerie taught us something different. She taught us that silence can be a form of strength when it protects someone who cannot protect himself yet. That dignity is not negotiable, even when the price seems reasonable. And that preparing in silence, when no one sees it, is sometimes the greatest act of courage there is. Alexander taught us that it is never too late to learn how to stay. That the first step does not have to be perfect. That sometimes it is enough to take the hand someone small offers you in the dark. Matthew did not know he was changing his father's life that night in the patio. He only reached out his hand because it was natural. Because children have not yet learned to protect themselves from people who look at them with that kind of hunger. Not hunger for food, but hunger for lost time. Maybe adults should remember how to do the same. If this story reminded you of someone, if it made you think of a silence you have been carrying or a truth still waiting to be spoken, tell us in the comments. There is no judgment here. Only people who understand that life is long, and that making mistakes is not the end. Not as long as someone eventually learns how to stay.